Pleased to have with us this evening Norman Reuter from Northeast London Polytechnic, who brings us a special lecture tonight, 25 years of British architecture, somewhat in honor of the Queen's Silver Jubilee. And this will be the third visit we verified this evening for Norman to the College of Architecture and Planning. He first met Marlon Roseman on the original PolyArc London Lab program several years ago, and subsequently came to speak to us here in 1974 and assist and acquaint the people going on PolyArc 2 with what they would be in store for, and then stopped in again in 1976 to talk to the upcoming PolyArc 3 group. He's here tonight to deliver a lecture to us and has been helping for the last week both in design studios and talking to the PolyArc 4 group. Norman pointed out to me this evening that he, like the lecture tonight, has been involved with architecture for the last 25 years and includes a varied collection of experiences ranging from work as early as 1952 in this country in Louisville, Kentucky for Reynolds Aluminum. Later, he returned to work in New York on the original Pan American building at what is now John F. Kennedy International Airport. Returned to England, worked on a number of projects, including the Schweppes factory. We're all probably filled with Schweppervescence tonight in anticipation of the talk. Worked for the Department of Education Science in the Research and Development area, investigating future problems of education and producing prototypes, one of which included Norman working on the first open-plan primary school in England. He then, since that time, has worked on a number of university buildings, libraries, and has been teaching at Northeast London Polytechnic, and for the last 10 years has been involved with heritage architectural tours, which he originated, taking people to the far corners of Western Europe and now branching out into travels to Russia and the Middle East. And will again be working with us on PolyArc Drip coming this spring. So would you welcome with me Mr. Norman Reuter. But before he stands up, I notice one other announcement I am to make. The student chapter of the AIA, the SCAIA, asks that if you're interested in seeing a 5-minute and 21-second presentation, which they had prepared for this afternoon before the electricity went out, which they call The Texture of Charleston. It is a coordinated slide presentation, apparently, of the National Forum Convention, which took place during the Thanksgiving break. And that will take place in the rear of this space at the first level, what is 104B, following questions and answers after Mr. Reuter's talk. So without further ado, Mr. Norman Reuter.
Right. Well, contrary to popular opinion, I did not bring the snow with me this time, and I wasn't responsible for the power cut at 4 o'clock this afternoon. One other thing I will say about this lecture, I'm going to actually try and get myself a little loose. There'll be some quite interesting buildings on the screen, and I don't want you to get the wrong impression, because as a foreign visitor I would probably like to show you some of the better side of British architecture. And so you'll have to realize there is a certain schizophrenia in this lecture. The images will be well, I won't say they're beautiful, but some of them will be interesting. And that covers up the real story that you see the beautiful, but there's a hell of a lot more that isn't. And I'm not coming here to kind of run down British architecture, but I think I'm coming to be a realist and point out that there are quite a lot of things wrong. But I think that will come out during the lecture. The lecture kind of follows several themes. One theme has had to be cut out because I left a box of slides in England. That is the story of the new towns. One of the rather more interesting things. To my two operators, I don't think we'll experiment with music. It sometimes is disastrous. We had a little idea, but we've had no time to rehearse it, so I think we'll go straight in. Could I have the... I think I control these. Do I control it from a master switch? We have had, as I say, because of the power cut, we've had absolutely no chance to rehearse, so I'm not sure what I use. Oh, that's all right. Well, right and left, all right. So, and the back button, that's okay.
This is the left.
Wait a minute.
This one.
This is going to be tricky.
This is your left, and this is your right.
Right, all right. So, Silver Jubilee. Oh dear, I have to actually hold these two things. Yes, I think that's going to be much better. Right, I thought we'd just start with the Silver Jubilee, and it was 25 years. And just to give this lecture some kind of relevance, we were going to do a little pictures and music, just to give you a bit of the thing that the British can do well. Our money may be rather shaky, we may be having our firemen on strike, and we don't know what the future brings, but we can put on a good show every now and again, and I suppose in life that's a very good thing. So I thought just for a few moments I'd give you, I mean, some of you may have only come to see pictures of the Queen, and therefore, well, I don't want you to be disappointed, so we'll have a few pictures of the Queen and the Silver Jubilee. We'll even show the future king meeting his mum on the steps of, well, if you could recognise Charles in all that. He's quite a good lad, is our Charles. I'll have a word to say about him in a minute. And they're all lined up with one or two trying to steal the show, wearing the green. I'm sure that was against all the rules, but never mind. And then they go back to the palace, or I think they're actually coming out of the palace, and the Queen has a walk round and talks to some of the 50 million, you see. It's all very nice, and they go back to the palace, and lots of people come and see them at the palace, and you're seeing as what they see from the balcony, and there you are, seeing them all waving on the balcony. So that we might say ends the Silver Jubilee. Now we can get out to the real business. Well, so we've only got a few more days left of it, so we will now go on to more serious business. I'm feeling tied with these two buttons, but I suppose there's nothing to... What I am showing you here is England, or much of it, and Indiana to exactly the same scale. And so you can see that you can almost fit England into Indiana. You stretch across the border a bit. And what you have to remember, and I think it's probably rather difficult for you to imagine this, it's as if you had got 40 million, there are 55 million in the British Isles, but if you had got 40 million people living in Indiana, then you get a kind of idea of scale. And I think that's rather important. So those two maps are just to put you in scale. Now, I think before we go into the 25 years, I think I have to do one or two things, which I had meant to put I'd meant to put a chalkboard on the front, and I was going to put a left-hand column and a right-hand column. And the left-hand column would have called one kind of qualities of English architecture, and the right hand would have been the opposite. And so one of them would have certainly been picturesque, and the other side of it would be classical. So I'm showing you this pervading influence. I've showed it before, but I think it must be shown again. This pervading influence of the British, how they took the 17th century paintings that Frenchmen were doing in Rome, just to confuse things, Claude Lorraine and Poussin, and bring it, and 100 years after they were painted, that is in the middle of the 18th century, starting to create landscapes which were picturesque. And I'm showing a Poussin and Stourhead in Wiltshire, and then no, that was a Claude Lorraine. This is a Poussin and the estate which some of you have visited anyway at Bowood. And you get the impression, you see it's this kind of asymmetry, this kind of, not the formality of those people across the channel. And it all derives from these paintings, and hence the term picturesque. So I will keep referring to this. Now, one or two other things I ought to show you is, in fact, a few of the buildings that had been built prior to the last war and which set the seal of the modern movement, or introduced it into England. High Point on the right up in Hampstead, by a firm called Tecton, included a Russian called Lubetkin, who was a refugee from Russia. He was one of those constructivist period who escaped west. I will mention also that was a very young man working in that office at that time, and we're talking about 1930, and his name was Dennis Lasden, and he will appear at the end of this talk in the last building I show you. So you can connect Mr. Lasden as a young student there with the last building, and this of course is the Penguin Pool at the London Zoo, again by Mr. Lubetkin. Russia comes to London, the Russian constructivist period in London, 1933. And then our underground stations, this yacht club on the East Coast, 1933. And the Boots factory at Nottingham, and Peter Jones' store in Chelsea, both 1933 or 34 on the left, about 1935, 36 on the right. Now I say that because one has to set the architecture of England after the war in the context of 20 years of nothing happening really. In fact, it may be the same in America, and what I will say is any remarks I make are about England or Great Britain, and they may at times hit a chord with what might have been happening in America at the time, but I am talking purely and simply about my own country. And we had the Depression from the 1930s, not as badly as America, and then we had a World War, and then we tried to get over it. And so when you come to 1952, which is the time that our Queen came to the throne, and as Bruce pointed out, on February the 6th, 1952, I was living in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, about 7 miles east of Louisville, and I was rung up at 3 o'clock in the morning by a gentleman from the Louisville Courier-Journal who said, "The King's dead." And if you've ever been woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you think, well, you're joking. And the result was the Courier-Journal put the headline, "Englishman says of King, you're joking." So I think that was my first contact with the press, and I've been very guarded ever since, despite the fact that my name is Reuter, or perhaps because of it. And so we have the period after the last war. And if I set the scene, I won't set it in 52. I'm going back 1 year, 1951. And we had a Festival of Britain in 1951, and this is the poster for it on the right, and the Illustrated London News showing the south bank of the Thames as it appeared in 1951. And we will begin at the South Bank and we'll end this lecture at the South Bank. Or I think we will anyway. I'm not quite sure what this is. I think we will. If we end at all. And it was decided that England needed an exhibition to kind of to, in a sense, show that we were recovering from the war. At the last moment, it was suddenly realized that it was 100 years after Paxton's great exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851, so it was quickly decided that it was a centenary of that. And as a little concession to it, they made a tiny little model of the Crystal Palace at the very last moment. But it was not, this was not the object. And if I tell you in 1951 that there was no street lighting, shops were not allowed to be lit, that we had, and I checked this, we had half a pound of meat a week, 4 ounces of butter and 4 ounces of margarine, half a pound of sugar. So in a sense, it was very, very kind of utilitarian. And this exhibition was meant to kind of turn the tide. And it was really rather an affirmation of faith. What you see here is the exhibition ground with the newly created concert hall, which you can, and I'm going to try this pointer as well as, it's going to be tricky. No, I'm not going to try the pointer. And you see the railway line going across the middle. There's Waterloo Bridge in the background, a pier in the front, and the railway bridge, and behind it is the newly built festival hall. Right, well, let's see if we can go forward. Well, there we have that site as it was just before 1951. What was remarkable about this exhibition was it was a political decision made only about 15 months before the exhibition should take place, and 18 months. And therefore that concert hall, which you can see in the middle of the picture on the right, the festival hall, had to be designed and built in 15 to 18 months from the decision to have it. And of course, what happened was it was designed by the then London County Council Architects Department under 2 very good architects, the chief architect Robert Matthew and his deputy Leslie Martin, later Sir Leslie Martin, and these names will come up again. And so this whole site was developed, and here we see what was the site before they started excavating, with the shop tower, which you can see on the left of the left picture, just to the left of the festival hall on the right. And this exhibition brought in a whole lot of young architects. Well, they were possibly not quite so young, because most of the architectural students of the period who were graduating were people who had gone through the war. And therefore, they were not 23 or 24. They tended to be about 10 years older, because they were people who, most of them, gone through the war and studied after the war. And they set the kind of generation of people from that time. Now let's see. And so this little feature on the left by day, half finished, is the Skylon, which was meant as a perfect, as a vertical feature, which at night lit up, as you see it on the right, and it was kind of symbolic thing of the festival. And there was, as I remember, these fountains that you can see on the left were rather remarkable, because they had flames running in the water, and so you had a combination of water and flames, which looked rather good after, except that they were slightly afraid that people would complain about wasting power. Now, that has a certain modern ring about it, but it was the first time, you see, for about 12 years that anybody had been able to waste anything, and so in fact we all enjoyed it. And that is and so from there, this is my 2 slides to talk about England's new towns. by courtesy of Ball State Library, your slide collection. This is Cumbernauld, and what I would like to have shown some slides of the new towns, because they do illustrate the kind of one of the remarkable developments in England, or Britain, I will say, this being in Scotland. You have to be, if there's any Scotsman here, they'll have to be very careful. I say England, I really mean Britain. We had these generations of new towns. I think there are about 30 of them now. They will, when they're completed they're supposed to be completed in the 1980s, they will house altogether something like 3 million people, I believe. As I say, there are roughly about 30 of them. They actually come in generations, and the first generation are basically around London, and they were put around the generally about 30 miles around London, the idea being that people shouldn't commute from them, they were beyond the green belt. What is interesting about them is that they are not a post-war creation. In fact, a lot of what was happening in England, or has been happening in the last 25 years, was being organised and set in motion in the late 1930s. What is also interesting, under a Conservative government. I have to bring politics in because, in fact, we have Conservatives and Labour, and by and large, well, I will say that the initiatives are often taken under Labour governments, and it is surprising to find some very interesting developments taking place under Conservative governments just prior to the last war. But the idea of new towns was in fact being developed in the 1930s, and it was only in the 1940s that the first group of these came around, and now we are in, I think, where they talk about Mark III new towns, of which the town of Runcorn near Liverpool is one, and Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire is another. And I also, the newer new towns tend to be much larger than the older ones. The older ones were conceived of towns something of 50 to 70,000. The new ones, Milton Keynes is 250,000, and there's another one up in Lancashire, which is a group of towns which are being joined together, which it has an ultimate population of 500,000. So it does in fact help to shorten the lecture that I can leave those out. So what I would do is talk about housing, and this is how the modern movement struck suburbia in the late 1930s, and I always think they're rather a joke. Now, of course, we think we use this kind of inward kitsch, and we all love them now. When I was an architectural student, we had to deplore them. Now we're allowed to like them. We don't know what we do in the 1980s, but that's what they call fashion. I still think they're just a joke, and I don't really like them. Anyway, that was the kind of brave new world of English suburbia, roughly like 1937-38. And so we do go on to early 1950s, and there is something of a change. And of course, remember, I have to have my two columns. Now, this is where I could refer to the column, and one column would have been Le Corbusier, Sweden. And so this is one housing estate just on the outskirts of London at Roehampton, and there happens to be about 4 years between them. There were two groups of architects involved in them, and you can see who they admire. With our Korab unités. This is 54, 55, the Marseille. Well, I think maybe I should show you one more. I hate to use this thing going backwards in case it doesn't work. We'll go forward and see what happens. Well, I will go back because I haven't got my slides there. I thought I had. Anyway, you can see the slab blocks a la Corbusier on the left, the point blocks a la Sweden on the right. And so these two great influences came into it. And I suppose we can call the one on the left the formal or the classical, and we can call the one on the right the informal or the picturesque, just to kind of get it all, the formal and the informal, to put the two camps in their particular squares, shall we? Now, let us go forward. There was in fact a few point blocks at Roehampton, and they were by the Korab faction, and they were much more rational, and they exploited precast materials, and I think extremely good of their kind. In fact, they have far, from my point of view, have far more architectural quality than the old brick ones, although again there's about 3 years between them. And just to give you, we have Mr. Corbusier on the right and London Southwest 16 on the left. And, a reasonable imitation. There's nothing like paying homage to the master, except, of course, that the subtlety of the Corbusier original is completely lost in the London suburban example on the left. I mean, what you have in Korab is a complete city. It is a place with shops, with schools, with large duplexes and old people's apartments and young people's apartments. What you get on the left, you do get the duplexes, those you can see. You do actually get one or two small people's apartments. They happen to be at the end of the right hand of that block, and you do have some small apartments with their single balconies on one floor facing out from the end. So, homage is one thing, and there we are. They ride out all over South London. They are a testimony to the 1950s. And I'm going to throw this, which is not a house, but this is, when talking about housing, I have to mention two architects, Alison and Peter Smithson, husband and wife, or should I say wife and husband. Some people do put it in that order. And they have been very, very influential in England as kind of philosophers. And this is the school they did in 1953 at Hunstanton in Norfolk. Now, it went against all the standards, and of course, on the face of it, it's homage to Mies. It's highly inappropriate as a school. I think the idea of young children being brought in this kind of brick and painted pipe environment went against all thinking. And it was the first building in England to be coined brutalist. The Smithsons later objected to it. At the time they didn't. I mean, there's always something in a certain notoriety. But they did later object to it, and quite rightly. I mean, not quite rightly here, it is brutal. And brutal, I mean, there's only one, we all know what we mean by brutal, and I would not want any architecture of mine to be described as brutal or brutalist. But I'm putting this in here because I don't come across the Smithsons until much later. And one has to point out that they were a very important intellectual and philosophical stimulus at this time, about 1953. I also happen to think that it is not really just homage to Mies. And so we find the Smithsons again in the late 1950s in London doing an apartment block. And brutalism, it certainly is. And we were before the great period of defensible space, which I think is surely the kind of every student's watchword these days. And brutal they were. I think they are architects' architecture. They look wonderful on the drawing board. The only thing is whether they're very pleasant to live in. And I thought of a little poem which I got out. It's from a poem called The House That Jack Built, 1973. I live forlorn on the 7th floor of a corporation flat, which the children all have fell from, and the pigeons have beshat. I do not mind the loneliness, the long evenings with the telly, but I do wish the wind hadn't altered the flight of the brick I dropped on Jack Kelly. And I think it summarizes all the kind of, well, the inhumanity that was creeping into housing at this time. And you can see in the early flats or apartments that I had shown you first of all, that the people were trying something. They had to break through after the war. If all right, if they were copying Korab, they were actually trying to achieve some of the best things that Korab had been saying. But I question this. And it also, because the Smithsons are quite influential, there was another group of flats, slightly earlier in fact than this, and that was at Park Hill in Sheffield. Great walls. Sheffield is our steel city. It's where, all our knives, most of our cutlery comes from Sheffield, an old industrial city. And on the outskirts, looking down on the city, it's pretty hilly. All the old 19th century workers' houses were torn down, and these large blocks of flats were built in their place. And if you think back to the picture before on the right and look at the picture on the left, you can see what I call the Smithson influence in the kind of facade. But there was a certain logic in this, because being sloping ground, the idea was that the roads would come in at every third floor, and people would only have to walk down or up about 1 or 2 floors from the kind of road decks which were created. These 12-foot wide road decks. Here you see what happens. You get it about 12, maybe more stories high. At the highest point, there are points of contact with the ground every third floor, and you went along. And these were called, I think the jargon was, in the centre, they were nodes of communication contact. I'm sure the inhabitants understood that. I remember some of our students did a survey. It's actually 2 of our students photographed this, and they talked to these ladies here, and they used the jargon, and they went up to this group and they said that did they find these streets were good for social intercourse, and I'm afraid they were misunderstood. But they were told, no, the only thing that happens here is mugging. Well, point blocks came and went. There's a point block that had international infamy in London called Ronan Point. Mr. Ronan happened to be a councillor in a borough in eastern London. I might add, for his sins, he was also a lecturer at North East London Polytechnic. So he may not have been a terribly good lecturer, but he's known throughout the world for the point block which collapsed, or rather the gas blew up and knocked half the building down. And so point blocks achieved a certain kind of notoriety. I might add that there weren't so many point blocks. I might also add that of the new housing since the war, and there have been, in the 25 years I'm talking about, there have been 8 million houses built. And of those, 75% are no more than 2 or 3 stories. And so that is why I'm saying to you, what I show you on here is the kind of tip of the iceberg. I don't talk about the kind of great seas of mediocrity that swept around England called council housing. Some of it, I might add, good, but we're talking about, this is minority architecture, I'm afraid, the point blocks which are so noticeable because of their height. And I'm showing you 2 or 3 point blocks in South London, which I think have a certain kind of character. I mean, the way of achieving it is so easy. I mean, just leave out a floor every 4th floor, and it gives it interest. But it does, in a certain sense, give it a certain silhouette. I question all the sociologist jargon about baby battering and all, and the loneliness. I can only say that if they were in middle-class neighbourhoods, they'd be very expensive to buy. And they happen to be working class and rented cheaply, that they are now in for a dig. In fact, what is happening with a lot of the point blocks in London now is because they have now become a political football, and it was even being contemplated pulling a lot of them down. That's because that little book called Defensible Space showed the example of St. Louis, of somebody who put some dynamite under a block of flats. And when you show people dynamite, it's rather catching. And so the idea is that we could have a few fireworks in London with some of these. But of course, we're not. What we're going to do with a lot of them is put students in them. And I think students would, well, I wouldn't mind being a student in that. When I look out across the road at that awful monster that you have down the road, I think I would actually rather live in one of these. And there's another example about a mile away, and the same. These are quite interesting, all industrialized building with possibly a kit of about 12 components. Of course, what we're talking about here is all housing. Everything I show you now is housing which has got to be produced to extremely stringent cost limits. And so we are talking about cheap housing by English standards, or certainly cheap by American. So, oops. Well, this is the tale of 2 corporation flats. And having gone up and been found wanting, we came down and along. And so we tried in the 1960s another approach. And so what I'm showing you is 2 London corporation estates. One of them, any polyart group will know on the right, because it's about 10 minutes walk from where they stay in Bloomsbury, and it's called the Brunswick Estate. And on the left, this is the Lillington Street Estate in Vauxhall. So what we are looking at is like for like, both built cheaply, both built for council or public housing, and so we can compare the two. And again, I like to put my classifications, formal on the right, picturesque on the left, informal on the right, informal on the left, and you can take your pick, you see. Now we're not looking at one lot, we can look at two at once. And here we are, on the right we have the kind of, somebody has been looking at his Italian futurist drawings of Saint Hilaire, 1914 or so, and well, it makes a nice image and it uses up a nice lot of concrete, so we're approaching, and we approach either formally on the right or informally on the left. It creeps up on us at right, it falls on us or hits us on the head on the right. It's what is known as the grand gesture, all done on cheap corporation public housing. And so we are approaching on both things, and well, you can take your pick, you see. Well, no, unfortunately you can't, nor could I, because I couldn't live there because I'm a professional. And we approach inside, and we find, you see, the two factions very much, the informal, the picturesque on the left, both using very economic means. The architects is young architects who won a national competition on the left, Darbourne and Dark. They were they were in their late 20s, I think, when they won that competition. And, oh my God, it's on the right. It's a combination of people, including a person called St. John Wilson, who was working with Sir Leslie Martin on the in the time when they were doing the Korab blocks that you saw first of all, and the festival hall at that period, and he's still thrusting out the concrete. Here on the left, the brick. And well, you see, you decide whether you like to live in a greenhouse on the right. And of course, when you're doing things formally, it doesn't terribly matter which way they face, as long as they look right. It just so happens those apartments happen to be facing west, and even in England it can get pretty hot when the sun shines on the windows. Well, it's all in the sake of formality and architecture, isn't it? And of course, the people on the left were also trying to house people in a slightly different way. They gave them rather shaded balconies, and there wasn't quite so much sun getting in. And the environment was somewhat more pleasing, keeping what few existing trees that existed. I might add that this is within, the one on the left, to locate it, is within a half a mile of Buckingham Palace. So it is not way out in the suburbs, it is way in the centre of London, very near the Tate Gallery, for those who know London. And the right-hand one, the approaches are pretty formal. It has a nickname. It's known as Alcatraz. Very appropriate. And the approaches, I say, are very formal. On the left, they have what some people would call muggers' alleys. In other words, there's lots of corners, and they've actually planted. This happens to be about 5 floors up, and it happens to have a lot of foliage being planted. And so the balconies, the access balconies, in fact, are hanging gardens as well as that, which of course adds to the humanity of the whole thing. And there we are. And there we see something of the change which is taking the 60s, 2 versions of the 60s. And the same architects as the left, Darbourne and Dark, then going out to another London borough, Islington. I should just point out London consists of 32 boroughs, and they each have a population of about 250,000 to 300,000. And so this is the London Borough of Islington, the architects of the left-hand scheme, the Lillington Street, being asked to create an estate amongst a lot of other 19th century buildings, a few 20th century buildings, Marquis Road, and so we're really coming down now. We're coming down to 3 and 4 stories, high density. And what I should tell you is that I don't know how you measure densities in America, but what I'm showing you here on these last 2 schemes and this scheme are 200 families to the acre, or 200 people to the acre, or I think you might call it 70 families to the acre, if you want to get that as density. So we call it pretty high density. And here you see the kind of new humanity is coming in. The care with the planting, the informality, the kind of trying to keep some of the old street scene as keeping any trees, any features which existed before. If you take up the roads, you reuse the cobbles. You actually might use a stretch of road in places and just make it paved. You may use a few old granite curbs as bollards, as on the left. And then we have again the opposite approach. A little more human, although it is in fact, it is a terrace in Hampstead, again, North London, which is about 30 units long. It has a slight curve to it to just give it some kind of form. And it does consist of 2 sets of maisonettes, or as you would say, I think duplexes, 2-floored flats, each with a balcony or a garden on each floor. A very formal solution, but I think better than Brunswick. And this is one of the last things last things to be built. It's in fact not finished, and it is in Hampstead again. It is overlooking a railway line, as you can see on the left, and it is about half a mile long. It backs onto the railway. It is on vibration-proof foundations. It has only rooms which are not living rooms or sleeping rooms, are facing the back overlooking the railway. It's a terribly formal solution. It is quite fashionable now to do this. The apology is that it in fact is keeping the style of the 18th century London square, which consists of repeated units about 4 or 5 stories high. Well, if you believe that, you'll probably believe most things. I don't actually think it's too bad. I couldn't get over, they surround these places with fences, as you can see, and I attempted very hard to get round over a fence, but couldn't, so you're having to see it from an adjacent building, and you're not seeing the front, which is quite interesting, and it does show one of the directions which housing is going in the 1970s, so the point blocks are all out. And we are going back to much more into small houses. And this is a housing scheme which was completed last year by a young English architect called Ted Cullen. And I think he is one of those architects, as they say, who's going places. He's a young man in his 30s, and he's done this housing estate in a suburban area. What is interesting about it is high density, but he's managed to achieve quite a lot by clever planning. In other words, the living rooms, it's on 3 floors. The living rooms and all the rooms have sloping ceilings. Now, we have things called regulations in England. I don't know if you do. I mean, I could tell you we have lots of regulations, but probably you do. And there are regulation heights. In other words, you can't go any lower. Mind you, the money won't let you build any higher. So in fact, you're virtually fixed at 7 foot 4 inches floor to ceiling. I'm giving you the imperial measure, not the metric one. And 7 foot 4, well, of course, if you're clever, you can bring here he's very clever because he brings his heights down to about 6'6" at the front and about 8'6" or 9 feet at the back. And so the mean height is 7'4". And this way you can win quite a lot of volume, because you see what we're talking about is a house can't cost more than a certain amount. You can't, I can't quote you the exact figures, and it wouldn't mean very much to you if I did. But you, these so-called cost yardsticks mean that nationally, and maybe this is strange to you. Well, they're not so strange, because let's face it, we can fit in England in Indiana. So if you had regulations for Indiana, why not have regulations for the whole of England? And so we do have regulations which govern all the design of houses and what they can contain and what they can't, and basically it's what they cost. And it is this ingenious solution of having sloping roofs and getting more cubic content, if you like, and winning what would normally be a kind of 2-story house becomes, I think, quite an interesting 3-story development, using this plastic coated steel as a roof. A lot of concrete block, masonry block. I noticed that I noticed two of my old friends from London, Linda and Jim, are here, and I haven't seen them since they're married. So congratulations! And knowing that you were doing the block study in London, I don't know if you ever got round to this one, but if you did you, Jim? No. Okay. Sorry. It's just about 3 months behind you. And, something's going. Well, this is how the other half live. You see, point blocks, working class people don't like, or so we're told, don't like tall point blocks. The affluent professional classes love them. And so they're prepared to pay fantastic sums of money to live in blocks like this. Now, I can't quite understand it. This is another council or public housing scheme. This is the Barbican in the centre of London, built by the City of London for renting, but of course it's renting at what they call the economic rent. And so if you're living on the top of that one, you do pay now about $4,000 a year for an apartment. And I'm not sure how that would rate in American terms, but it's very expensive in English terms. No, I'm sorry. Did I say 4,000? I'm getting mixed up. I'm trying to translate. It would be more between $5,000 and $6,000 a year, because they are very expensive. But anyway, it shows you that some people. Now, I think the real breakthrough in housing came with this scheme by the English architect Ralph Erskine, who had worked for 30 years in Sweden until he came back to England about 10 years ago, and he had this scheme to design in Newcastle in a slum area called Byker. It's known as the Byker Wall, and the whole idea was that there was to be on the left of us, on the left picture, and twisting round behind it, a whole new road system. And so the idea was to enclose some low housing with this wall, which is about 1 mile long, which is new buildings, and where necessary, joining on to old buildings. For instance, on the left-hand picture, right-hand side, is a 19th century laundry, which has just been joined onto the block, and it just goes round, forming this wall. And rather like the half-mile scheme I showed you, again, facing the road, you will only find toilets, bathrooms, staircases, things like that. All the living rooms face the other side. And his idea was, and this is, I think, one of the secrets of low-cost housing in England. What was happening for so many years was that when they tore down an area, they dispersed all the population to wherever they could find an empty place for them, and these people all got rather lost in their new surroundings. And what Ralph Erskine insisted on, and which he got the cooperation of Newcastle, was to say, say, no, we won't do that. What we will do is we'll develop a piece at a time, and we'll keep the people where we will design some we'll do the first part, and we will gradually move the people from old slum dwellings into new dwellings, but they will see their houses being built, and their apartments being built, and their friends and their community will remain. And this, I think, this particular scheme has been one of the real breakthroughs. I mean, in a way, it almost looks like do-it-yourself. It is, I mean, everything I've shown you, except for the Barbican, has got to be built very cheaply. And I think this feeling, it's I call it it's a very sophisticated system of obviously made to look very unsophisticated. But the people there can identify. And here this great wall, this is on the inside of the wall with some of the small housing, and the other thing which he insisted on, the planting of thousands of trees and plants. And these trees are here, they're all looked after, and these little picnic areas, these little and the whole thing now is really quite a remarkable piece of work. Here we are, and it's this, well, I think it's this kind of ad hoc quality. So if anyone's studying English housing, Ralph Erskine's Byker Wall is one that should be really studied. And I throw that in because whatever the architects do with their modern flats and houses, the users will treat it the way they want to, and there's nothing like a gnome in your garden. To do-it-yourself planting, as in this case here on the left. Well, the other area of architecture which has been remarkable has been in university building. And until the end of the last war, well, until about the 1830s, we had two universities in England, Oxford and Cambridge. We then added about 4 or 5 more of the big cities, Birmingham, Liverpool, London, and then a few more cities added civic universities. So by the end of by the period we're talking about, 1952, there were in fact 22 universities. And in the 25 years, 22 has become 44, plus another 28 polytechnics, of which I one, which were all creations of the 1970s. And so, in a sense, we have gone up also from 100,000 university students in 1952 to something like 500,000 now. And I think that is the level, and so that is 500,000 students in a population of roughly 50 million, so I don't know how that rates with America. But I don't know how many places in America have had opportunities to create new universities from scratch and to a plan, because this is an exciting challenge to architects. And in this little diagram on the right shows you the kind of either the centralized university, more or less all grouped close together, the faculty structure on the second drawing down, and the department structure or nuclear structure on third drawing, and what has been a very popular English model, the bottom one, the linear development, with your lines of communication running through, probably on 2 levels, with vehicles underneath and with pedestrians above, and from this line of communication, this horizontal line of communication, you will then put your departments off to one side, right and left or up and down, and from these, beyond that, you would put your student housing. And of course the advantage is that you can, within limits, you can add more to your linear development, or you can, and you can spread out to right and left. And so this is what became as known as quite a prototype of English university planning. And so I show you an example, Essex University. On the left, the plan, and I think I will attempt to use this pointer. Well, you can see the linear development. In fact, you can see dotted underneath the communication route, the vehicle route, coming in from the servicing, and then going right and left. In this case, series of courtyards running off from the pedestrian way, which is here, the various departments which can expand outwards, and then beyond that, housing in these kind of brick towers, which are student flats. Now, Essex University is very interesting because it is one of the leaders of student revolts in Britain, and the students blame the architecture. I mean, they started a revolt against the architecture. One can't understand quite, because in fact each of these floors is two self-contained flats, and they live in mixed communities, and for a large amount of time it has been co-ed situation. And one would have thought that was a perfect situation to live in, and within a comparatively short distance walking to the pedestrian way. But in a way, it becomes a very closed community. It's out because all of the universities have been put out on the right. Next to it, the Queen Elizabeth Hall. Now, this is the interesting thing. The design team for that building, the middle building, the blockhouse, if you like, the concrete building. My pointer is not working now. Oh, yes, it is. This building are the archigram team. And not many people realise that. So when you see archigram, they were then working for the Greater London Council, and it was before they left and set up by themselves that they actually produced this building, which is the one tangible building I think that archigram can claim, although it can't claim it. They were just architects working for the Greater London Council. And then behind it, opened this last year, is the National Theatre by Dennis Lasdon. And so we can just look at the Festival Hall as it was created in the 1951, and we're on the left. As I said, it was created and built in about 18 months. It had an extraordinary, and it tells us something about 1951, because politically, it could not have materials which could be seen to have a use in housing, because that would lead to political uproar at that time. So it also had to be built in 18 months, and so what they did, they used plate glass, they used Portland stone, and they had to calculate how much Portland stone could be cut, quarried, and brought on site at a certain time, and that was how much could be incorporated in the design. And so, and how many tiles they could get, how much plate glass they could get. And so, in other words, you start with a shopping list of materials, and then you design the building. And the building is, in a sense, the whole concept was supposed to be the egg of the concert hall floating in glass. Well, of course, it didn't quite succeed. And then in the 1960s, they came along and replaced a whole lot of it and gave it the 1960s look, moved the entrance round, and you can see, well, it was a fussy building, but it was more of one, but I'm not so sure that the slicked up 1960s building version is any improvement. In fact, I tend to think that the old one had a lot more honesty if one knows the story of the building. And then we look at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, telling us about the 1960s, the effect of the Smithson's brutalism, the use of concrete. Concrete, I might add, in this case, Concrete that was more expensive than if the building had been clad in the highest class of marble imported from Italy. And I think that is dreadful. That if you're going to use concrete which is the cheapest material, and in the end it ends up as the most expensive material, that is lunacy. But then, let's face it, the swinging 60s did have their element of lunacy about them. And here we have, actually the things have got out of phase now. We have the festival hall with its kind of rather clean antiseptic look, and the railway station look of the Queen Elizabeth Hall 1960s. So 1950s, 1960s with of course the little floating the cushions. They were, I might add, removed within 6 months of the building being open because the manager of the hall didn't like them. The architects had designed them, and they now reside in a comprehensive school in London, and not in. And he didn't like the nice smooth floor, so he put carpet on the floor. Oh well, clients. And there we have the two interiors: the 1951 Festival Hall and the 1965-67 Elizabeth Hall on the right, with its leather seats and its use of wood and concrete. And the wood in the Festival Hall, remembering that how much wood of different types can you get in the time to put it in, so you have to have about 3 different woods to get the effect. And the last building, the National Theatre, Glaston, there it is, and it's 3 theatres in one. The amphitheatre theatre there on the left, the proscenium theatre on the right, and there is a studio theatre tucked underneath. Now, Glaston tells us that his 2 things have influenced him in practically the whole of his career, and that is, and certainly on this building, and that is that he remembers the sketch which he saw as a student of the Citroën house, or the Domino house of Corbusier, this famous sketch which changed architecture, and the theatre Epidavros, and it's these 2 images which have created the National Theatre. And I will give you the East Anglia on the left and the National Theatre on the right, separated by about 5 years, and you see this kind of dominant feeling of tears of the importance of the corners of his buildings and the importance of the diagonal. And what we're looking at here is the amphitheatre theatre, the Epidavros theatre, if you like. And again, this combination of the concrete tiers, as he says, what Korab let us do was to use concrete as a material and create terraces. Terraces to walk on, terraces to plant, terraces to give the horizontal quality to buildings. And it sits by the Thames with St. Paul's in the background. And here we see the proscenium stage on the right with its fly tower going up behind the roof of the auditorium, poking through there. On the left, the amphitheatre, the Greek theatre type with its kind of tower, a different tower poking up behind, 2 commercial office blocks behind that. And the concrete there. And the spaces inside, I think, are magnificent. There is kind of very low spaces and occasionally tall spaces, the use of concrete there, and it does give a tremendous sense of space. And inside the Greek theatre, if you like, the Greek theatre at Epidavros is based on one centre point. What is interesting about this theatre is that it is based on seven centres, if you like, based on a circular stage, but there are 7 radii. And if you look, you can probably note they may look from here as though they're all based on the same point, but each section has a different centre point, and the centre points are all on that round stage which you can see there, and it is this important zone which is controlled by the centre points, the acting zone, which he says is so important, but he did not want to have everything centred onto one point. And I shall show you his workshop. I also show you, I think it's upside down. No, it isn't upside down as it happens. That is the round stage, which is the most remarkable piece of machinery. It cost $1.5 million, and it is the stage of the round theatre, and it does everything. It goes down, it goes up, it splits, it's the most fantastic thing. The only thing is we haven't got enough money to use it. Never mind, North Sea Oil's coming, we'll be able to do these things in the 1980s, and at least we've got somewhere to do it in. But I show this because the one thing that always impresses me about Ball State is the models everywhere. And I only wish our students did as many models as you do. And I'm glad to see that Mr. Lasden believes in models, dozens of them. And that is the corner of his office with his National Theatre model. I'm not sure whether, I think I like the building. Now, this is to end with The Tale of Two Buildings. And they show you the two sides of English architecture. The picturesque or the informal on the left, the formal, the classical, the machine ethic, if you like, on the right. The architect, again, on the left is the firm of Robert Matthew and Johnson Marshall. Robert Matthew, who designed the original as chief architects of the London County Council at the time when they designed the Royal Festival Hall, a designer of several universities, including the one at Stirling, the one at York, and here his firm designing a civic centre for the London borough, a suburban borough of Hillingdon on the left. And I can only say here, the vernacular strikes again. It's the most extraordinary building. And I hope the citizens of Hillingdon like it, because it's also one of the most expensive buildings that's been built in London, in England, in the last 20 years. And I'm told that the building now is well over 8 million above it, pounds, that is, that's about 14 million pounds, dollars, over its estimate. But, well, you have to pay for good building. That's what you tell your clients anyway. And I hope the citizens of Hillingdon appreciate it, because it was designed specially for them. It was said they lived in suburban houses. They did not really like aggressive modern building. So let us give them something they will like. And so we've given them the suburban house ethic, the English vernacular. We've just multiplied it a little. Now on the right, another architects I haven't mentioned, another young firm in their 30s, Richard and Sue Rogers. Well, they used to be Richard and Sue Rogers, but I think this building got them down. There's no longer Mrs. Rogers. But they were a young team. And they won a competition in Paris for the Pompidou Centre, which the French government built as a memorial to President Pompidou. And the English won it, and the French hate that. And so it's given them the most wonderful excuse to criticise this building. I might add it's also one of the most expensive buildings ever been built, because it cost them to date £120 million, which I suppose is $200 million. And we'll see. So we're looking at two 1970s buildings by English architects in the two different traditions, one in London and one in Paris. And as you can see, they are rather different. And one fits, and yet, and here we see a bit of old Paris with a bit of New England appearing above the skyline. And in Hillingdon, this kind of suburban house multiplied, and the use of brick is very nice. And here we have the right hand. Oh, hello. You know, Korab strikes again. Oh, he loved to have those funnels on his luxury liners. Well, let's give them an echo of Korab in Paris. And so we put a few ventilators on the ground. And this is an art centre, you realise. I expect you've seen the buildings. And there we are. That's the side of the building with its escalators and its Meccano set. And there's our office building on the left. And what is so extraordinary about this building on the right, I think the Pompidou Centre is a rather expensive joke, because it is an art centre. It's the most expensive building the French have got, and I think that might be the British having revenge on the French. We're trying to get them as bankrupt as we were. But of course, the one thing about the French, if they decide to build something, they'll pay for it. And it is a perverse building, because for some strange reason, they wanted to have great column-free floors inside, spanning roughly 100 feet or more. The idea being that you can have the ultimate in flexibility. So to achieve that, you put all your innards on the outwards. And so you put all your ventilation ducts, your heating pipes on the outside. And of course, those were the 1960s. Now, of course, if you examine the logic of this, to put a heating pipe on the outside means you've got to wrap it in a hell of a lot of insulation, far more than if you put it on the inside. And now also, they wanted to have the kind of machine ethic, and so it has great trusses spanning across inside. But you're not allowed to have exposed steelwork inside the building, even in France. So you wrap your great trusses in insulation, fire insulation, and then of course you coat them with sheets of stainless steel just to make it look as if they were real steel trusses. And so it's a very, very strange building. And that's how you get a big and expensive building, and also an illogical one. And there you are, you see the kind of wide open spaces there. There's a question, for an arts centre, do you need it? I say this as somebody who went into the building and leaned against a partition containing 2 Picassos, and there was just an L-shaped one, and it only needed 2 of us to lean, and we've had $2 million worth of Picasso on the ground. And it just struck me that a few columns might actually have stabilised the partitions. But, well, you have to pay for an idea. So there we are. There is, I had in fact, but I'm not going to keep you any longer, and I'm sure that's glad. I was going to I thought at some point in this, I might actually refer to notes which I had written, and my notes are completely different from much that I have said. And at some point, about 2/3 of the way through, I actually was going to refer to the state of architecture and the state of education, because I've shown you a lot which, if it's not good, is interesting. And I've purposely, because, you know, I don't know about you, but I just can't, I can't photograph things I don't like. And so I couldn't, and I just did not want to include anything. So I've tended to show you a lot of what I think is good or interesting or controversial, and can, I think, be called architecture. And I think I have to kind of do a miniature State of the Union ending to this, looking at my own country. Remember, I popped in here in January of this year. The pound had never been so low. Now I come from here in England, where their foreign currency reserves have never been higher. I can't explain it. Industrial growth is not improving. Unemployment's not improving. In fact, I'm told it's going to get worse. And everyone talks about our saving grace, North Sea oil. And really, what I would say is that looking back, we managed to reach the moon, or you did, we didn't, by 1970, and I think very soon after we began to wonder whether it was all worth it. It's one of those ironies, isn't it, that somebody walking around on the moon, probably one of the greatest achievements man has ever done, is now considered, if it ever happens, as slightly a bore, just another item on the newsreel. And in a sense, we have lost our sense of wonderment. And so we see those 1950s and 1960s with architects, and I'm talking about my country, maybe it means it's the same in yours. We have architects rushing to transform the environment, usually by knocking things down and putting things in their place, and seeming neither really to know or care what the effect might be. And if we look back, it was a period, and I think especially in the 1960s, which was one of the most bizarre in British history. We had a Prime Minister in 1964, Harold Wilson, dear Harold. He's gone now. He's writing his memoirs and making a fortune. That's politics for you. Well, he emerged in 1964 and promised us the white heat of technological change, and that rather smouldered and went out. We had James Bond, he kind of staggered from one bed to another with a revolver in one hand and you know what in the other. And he's a bit passé and gone now. And we've had the Beatles, the Stones, and Elton's now retiring, all making a fortune, of course, and telling us a lot about how we should live. We have architects and their clients busy destroying, and I think they did. And actually, if we look back, it was a kind of hectic illusion, and which was shrouded in our country by a kind of apparent affluence. You've never had it so good, was what our Prime Minister Macmillan said. Well, I suppose that's true. Everything mushroomed. So you've seen, we've had universities and polytechnics. Each little town wanted its university, and old universities doubled and trebled in size. Research was pursued everywhere in the belief that any knowledge, however trivial or fatuous, was going to help somebody somewhere. And having spread like cancer, housing went across, it went up and it went down again. Town centres were transformed with, with buildings biting the dust by the hour, and replaced by what could only be described as aesthetically bankrupt and antiseptic commercial development. We had our democracy and we transformed it to bureaucracy, and as a kind of antidote to bureaucracy they had something which is called public participation. That is, I think, what we call bureaucracy democracy, and participation led to conflict, affluence led to bankruptcy. And so this is one particular Englishman who has a natural cynicism, which I think is rather healthy. I was cynical of the age. I might add, it also produced great things. Everything was growth and expansion. It was the key to everything. It was to be bigger, it was to be better, it was to be richer. It was an accompaniment to an increasingly urban society. There was a lavish consumption of energy. There was industrialization of farming and food, so that food, I might add, became, I would say, and I dare say it, rather Americanized. You took your loaf and you took everything goodness out of it and you put a few chemicals in. We also lived under the belief that a consumer society and a welfare state would look after us if everything else went wrong, and in fact it probably has, and everything has gone wrong. And architecture really paralleled this kind of development. It was sometimes innovative, it was sometimes exciting, it was often arrogant, and usually out of scale, and often very inhuman. And the godsend came unexpectedly in 1973, when those two countries which have decided to make it up, Israel and Egypt, went to war. And that changed the course of architecture in England. The Yom Kippur War and the resulting increase in the price of Arab oil, well, it was England's, well, it has in fact transformed England from a Garden of Eden to a Garden of Allah. And it has had the effect of rather like an Alka-Seltzer after the party. It's cleared our heads and brought us to our senses. And we no longer can do buildings like on the right. And I will tell you one little statistic which I picked up from Time magazine from 2 weeks ago, which I find encouraging, having been so cynical about my country, that the oil consumption in BTUs, I hope you use that term, in 1970 in Britain was 155 BTUs per capita. 155 million, I should say. No, sorry, I'm not sorry. Wait a minute, I've got my digits wrong, but let's use 155 as a figure. And in 1977 was 142, and that is a reduction in 7 years of 10%. And in America, whereas it was 150 in Britain in 1970, it was 270 in America, and is now 355. So is in fact up 30%. And I can understand President Carter's energy campaign. And I can say that really one of the great things about England at the moment, at least they have come to their senses, we have in fact got an oil situation where we are going to be one of the 3 countries of the, shall we say, developed countries of the world which will be self-sufficient in energy in the 1980s. And it's how we use that time, that resource, because it's only 10 to 15 years, and it's how we use this wealth, whether we will use it to develop alternative sources of energy using the revenue, whether we will use the profit to train our young people in skill and skill, I think, is one of those things which is noticeably lacking. It's one of those things you didn't need in the swinging 60s. The eggheads went to college and the others went on come on the dole. And I hope we can do something. And I also might just comment about architectural education, the fact that you are being visited at the moment, and say that I think architectural education in England has been through a bad patch. We've had our arguments whether it should be tradition or progressive. Tradition followed a set of principles which had based on tradition. I define tradition as being an accumulation of bad habits. Progressive was apparently doing most things but not knowing quite what you were going to get out of it in the end. We developed a kind of syndrome which I call, well, I think it was typical to send your student out with a tape recorder to count the number of pregnant women crossing the traffic crossing at 12 o'clock on a Friday and ask yourself what you could make of that. Well, the result is nothing. And in fact, the architecture that resulted into that kind of thinking was a nothing. But I think we're learning our lessons now. And what I would say is that as a visitor to your school, I've always been very pleased by the attention which you pay to things such as technology, although, well, I'm not going to go, yes, I will say technology, I'll use it broadly as that, I will see that your humanities are well catered for, and I think from what I see, a far more balanced picture than I can see in my own country. But we're learning, and I think rather than go on, I would just leave it that English architecture has been through an interesting patch, but I have shown you the best. And it is the challenge of the 1980s and the kind of generation which you as students in your country are going to become. I would, I think, just end and cut out a lot by giving you a few slogans or quotations, because slogans and quotations can often say more than a lot of prose. And one thing which came out from our own architectural, our equivalent of the AIA, the RIBA, was this slogan, which I think came out 2 years ago: long life, loose fit, low energy. And I think that actually, in 6 words, does summarize the way we should be, as architects, should be looking at our architecture. And I'll give you a little quotation from Reuter, who I've probably heard. You should get him here sometime. He's very entertaining, very learned gentleman. He usually rides here on a bicycle, even from, I think it's Syracuse where he is, or somewhere up in that part of the world now. This is him talking about Stirling and Gowan, but I think the quotation is quite good. A degree of dexterity is not necessarily a disadvantage for an architect. I'll give you one from Dennis Lasdon. Our job is to give the client, on time and on cost, not what he wants, but what he never dreamed he wanted. And when he gets it, he recognizes it as something he would have wanted all the time. And I'll give you another one from a young man who was it was written in 1948 for a student magazine by a then student, a very talented man called Michael Ventris. I worked with him at the Department of Education and Science for 6 months before he got killed as a very young, comparatively young man. But his claim to fame is not so much as an architect, but he discovered this language called Linear B, which has opened up all the translations of archaic Greek. And so it was this young architect who is an outside interested, but he wrote in a student magazine in 1948, there are too many of us, I presume he means students, architectural students, there are too many of us, there are no jobs, travel is ended, reactionaries are still at the top of the profession, craftsmanship is dying, and the architect is unrespected. But if the visual order of England in the second half of the 20th century depends on anyone, it depends on you, meaning the architectural students at that time. If you could possibly afford it, keep with architecture, help regain that paradise. And I'll just give you just one last one from my favourite philosopher, Bertrand Russell, which is very short and to the point. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. And so with that, and these 2 examples, and after a terribly long lecture, I'm sorry, but I do believe Skidmore Merrill kept you much longer, I will end. Thank you very much.